Let's start with the weirdest and move our way to the most horrific punishments in human history. Number 15, the gay bomb. During the early days of war, scientists were experimenting with ways to punish mass amounts of people by spraying or spreading different chemicals. One of these would be from said gay bomb. This is a bomb that contained a large amount of hormonal chemicals which they hoped would generate a specific type of attraction among soldiers, which would cause mass confusion and even panic within their platoons. They would begin to see each other in a more romantic way, you could say. In all of the documents related to the project, the possibility was canvassed that a strong smell could be dropped on enemy troops, ideally one that would cause homosexual behavior. The documents described the form of punishment as distasteful, but technically not lethal. So it isn't actually the most horrific of punishments, but you could definitely call it, if you will. Number 14, the upright jerker. This device would catch the notability of a large amount of people's attention during the 19th to early 20th century in the USA. The upright jerker was a common punishment method that often led to death, where it would work similar to a conventional hanging. However, instead of dropping someone into the floor of the gallows, it would instead yank them up into the air by using weights and pulleys. The warden of Connecticut State Prison at Wethersfield actually patented this technique, calling it the automatic gallow on June 18, 1995, where he quoted, "The object of my invention is to provide an apparatus or machine by means of which the penalty of capital punishment may be inflicted with certainty by devices that are certain to extend automatically, by which remain wholly under the control of the public officer until the final moments." I don't know why I decided to play posh British music there for an American warden, but we'll go with it. Number 13, the Newcastle Cloak. The Newcastle Cloak was a barrel filled with holes cut to the top and sides to make room for the victim's arms, heads, and even limbs. After being strapped into the barrel, the victim would have to walk through town, often getting stoned and pushed over in the process. It came to existence after being drunk was made a civil offence as a result of the Alehouse Act in 1551. If found drunk in public, you would be put in a barrel and paraded through town, which often resulted in people falling over and rolling around like Donkey Kong barrels while violently vomiting from alcohol consumption. So, as a result, it became immensely popular, and it was a pretty cruel punishment. But comedically, S tier. Number 12, the Halifax Gibbet. And not to be mistaken for the British car place, it was actually what was to be believed as the very first version of the guillotine. You see, the Halifax Gibbet was used on market days to ensure that there was a large enough audience to be able to witness the executions. A convicted felon was detained in custody for 3 market days, which would often last for 3 weeks or so. On the day of the execution, the convicted would be marched through the towns and taken to the gibbet roughly half a kilometer away. It was actually a pretty embarrassing way to go out, but hey, guillotine is guillotine. Number 11, impalement. Impalement has been something throughout history as being used as imitation, execution, and even deterrent. But it might not be what you think it actually is. You see, the definition of impalement is actually different than this sort of machine because it actually goes through someone's rectum and out of their mouth. Or, in other ways, stab through their chest and out behind them, and they'd be waved around on a hanging pole through their head. It was very common as a deterrent, but it was mainly used in 1462 when Vlad III, Prince of Wallachia, wanted to welcome people by proudly displaying the impalement of Ottoman's prisoners of war that were captured. Definitely wasn't the most appealing of punishments, you could say. Number 10, death by rats. There have been numerous ways in which people have been killed by rats, for example obviously the Tower of London rat dungeon, but not to be confused with the game Dungeon Rats, victims would actually be placed in a deep pitch black cell in the Tower of London. When the tide changes, rats would swoop in from the River Thames and start nibbling on the victim's flesh. But compared to the other instance of rat torture that we just talked about, death by rats, you would probably wish you ended up in a cell instead. During the Dutch Revolution, Diederik Sonoy used a method where he would fill a pottery bowl with rats and push it into his stomach of a prisoner, where they would put hot coals on the other end of the bowl, which would cause the rats to eat their way out of the victim's stomach to escape, leaving the victim screaming in pain for the duration of the punishment. So next time you walk in New York and you see a little rat crawling on the street, just know what those little fuckers have done before you try to kick it. Number 9, the Roman candle. Even though it might sound like a fancy way of setting the mood during a date night with your favorite James Charles, the Roman candle was instead a form of execution used by the Romans to kill someone in a slow and humiliating way. Following the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD, Emperor Nero was desperate to blame someone for the fire which destroyed over 2/3 of the city. Without any evidence, Nero blamed the Christian community for the fires and as such rounded up all the Christians he could find. They were tortured in an attempt to get them to shun their faith, but those who didn't were awaiting a much more painful demise actually, where the victims would get oiled up and they'd light the fire directly at their feet. The fire was set in a way that the victims would survive the longest, causing the prolonged and painful death. Jesus Christ, that's horrific. Number 8, Bzerde la Ver. Now, this is where it gets relatable to you guys, because the prisoners will be blindfolded and fastened to a chain before being lowered into a deep shaft from the top of a castle to the deep underground in a dark room. After being stuck in the dark chamber underground, the prisoners will be ordered to kiss a statue of the Virgin on the other side of the dark room. Now, that's where it gets relatable. When the prisoner walked over there and raised his lips to kiss the statue, a trapdoor would open, dropping them into a pit wheel of spikes. You see, the name Bzerde la Ver actually translates to Virgin's Kiss, which is something I'm sure that most of you are relatable to, huh? If you're not subscribed. Number 7, the Lingchi. Not to be confused with Lingzi from your local Chinese takeaway, was actually formerly known by the death by 1,000 cuts, in which someone would grab a local kitchen knife and slowly remove body parts in the most horrific way imaginable. You would no longer be a human, and rather a crying lobster prepared for boil. The punishment would follow a horrific 3-step plan coming up to a boil though. As before, you'd be publicly humiliated, left to marinate, and finally put out of your misery. Lingchi was only used in very extreme circumstances and crimes, as it was against most of the Chinese cultures, meaning that the only times it was really ever used was for high reason, mass murder, or patricide. Number 6, the Brazen Bow. The Brazen Bow was essentially one of the most horrific punishments ever made, as instead of being cut to pieces to be boiled, you were instead put to boil as whole, and not even seasoned. You see, most of the time the name was exactly how it sounded, where people were forced inside a brown bronze bowl that featured a pipe system within it to make sure that the victim's screams were heard like a bellowing of a bull. And as suggested, a fire was lit below, roasting the person inside to death. The crazy part about it though is that apparently the guy that created it also faced the same death in order to show the king what he meant. But you would think that they would just leave him in there, right? Well, once he was pan-seared, he was then removed and for some reason was thrown off a cliff. Why? I don't know. Comedically S tier. Number 5. Bamboo torture. One of the defining features of bamboo is how fast it actually grows, and actually how strong it is as well. You see, this is apparently enough to inspire people in South Asia to create horrendous torture methods with it. An example of this would be bamboo torture, where the victim would be strapped to the bed with small bamboo planks underneath it, which would slowly pierce through the skin, causing a slow and extremely painful death. This method of punishment was actually investigated by the Mythbusters, who found that bamboo could pierce through several inches of ballistic gelatin. Number 4. Molten Metal. Even though this punishment sounds bad, it was actually even worse than you could ever imagine. The Molten Metal punishment would start with the victim being strapped to the chair, and then being beaten and abused until they were unable to recover their breath. Now, this is where it would actually start to get horrific, because then they were strangled until they were about to suffocate. Then the molten metal, often gold, would be poured down their throat, causing 3rd-degree burns and in most cases, a slow and painful death. Just sounds like Taco Bell, really. Number 3. Scaphism. A lot of people liked bugs growing up, but the Greeks liked it just a bit too much. You see, a Greek philosopher called, Plutarch. Yeah, okay. Recorded a technique that would involve trapping a victim between 2 boats, where Instagram Reels users would love that they were covered in milk and honey and left to fester in a bog to be slowly eaten alive by insects. I'm not saying that the eaten alive part, but you guys are weird on Instagram. Number 2, Chinese water torture. Now, this is where it starts to get horrific. You see, the Chinese water torture method predominantly relied on mental torture designed to make the person go insane in an attempt to pull confessions, info, and more. This method itself was first documented by a weird guy, Hippolytus de Marcellus, having watched drops of water falling one by one on a stone, gradually creating a dent in the stone. He decided to apply this method to the human body and began to see the effects. The victim would be stripped of their clothes, thrown in public, tortured, and then driven insane while people watched, mocking and laughing at them. The victims could see each drop coming of the bucket and over time would become so frantic to the point where they were going insane. Generally, the victims would have ulcers forming on their head either from the water or the immense restraint, stress, isolation, and humiliation. Now, this wouldn't necessarily kill the person per se, but it wasn't very nice, I'll say that much. And number 1. The pear of anguish, sometimes referred to as the choke pear. This fruity misconception was invented in the early modern period. It consisted of a rod with pear-shaped flaps at the end which would be opened with a spring. To use the trap, simply insert it into the desired bodily hole and open the flaps, creating immense pain for the recipient. The origins of the device are unknown, with some people claiming that it was used in medicine, but hey, as long as it's not going in my butthole, I'm happy with it. And that's it. And if you like more history content like this, make sure to subscribe.